Hey, developer community. So good to see you again. I am here today, Kirby Fitch, to talk to you about a quick start for management of inactive identities. What are some of the favorite things that I have about this feature to say? Well, first off, it's in production for 400 tenants as of yesterday. Really glad to get it out to production. Super psyched that a ton of you already had a chance to give it a whirl and sandbox. We've been watching that pretty carefully. Really love the engagement we've had and all the comments that you've left us. Really kind of watching that very carefully. And today, just super stoked to talk you through how to set up this feature, how to get it in your hands first in sandbox and then in production. So let's go ahead and go through it. First, we're going to talk a little bit about the problem. We're going to bring you to the solution from there. We're going to bounce through a recommended configuration. And then finally, we're going to end talking about influencers and how you can be one. All right, so what is the problem? There are a couple different aspects that I'm going to tackle this from. First, you have inactive identities. What we've seen, just based on a couple different ways of studying it, is that there are about 1 in 5 inactive identities in any given tenant. Some have more, some have less. It kind of depends on your implementation. What is an inactive identity? If you're a corporation, it's somebody who's separated from your business. They may have been terminated. They may have moved on. If you are a university, they may have been a student and then they become an alumni. But the really kind of big distinction is that at one point you consider them active. They no longer are, so they don't need to receive all the services and access to do things that an active identity might do. So in particular, the problems that you've told us about, that you've voiced most strongly, are the 3 that I've got on the screen here. The first one, users requesting access for inactive identities. So that is literally going to the request center, putting in someone's name, and despite having departed the business, you're able to find them, select them, and put in an access request. That introduces unwanted risk. Administrators don't want to deal with that. Second, managers accessing the team view. Managers have told us that they basically only want to see the people who work for them right now, not the people who have worked for them in the past. So that was also an easy one to solve. And then lastly, a little bit more nuanced, but there's a lot of processing going on in your tenant throughout the day. You have aggregations, you have scheduled processing, you have the processing that you kick off on your own. Sometimes we talk about processing also as refreshes, as what you might know it as. There are a lot of cases where we were processing inactive identities where we don't really need to do that. And if you're thinking about this from a 1 in 5 problem, that might mean that with this new feature in place, once you've adopted it, the time it takes to process your identities could be cut by as much as 20%, maybe more if you have more inactive identities. So then there's the kind of third way to look at this problem, which is from lifecycle states. When we first built up Identity Security Cloud, we delivered to you lifecycle states that you could configure however you wanted. A lot of customers go with the basics. They have 2 lifecycle states, active and inactive. Some get a little bit more built out. They'll have 5 states, like a pre-hire and an active, and a leave of absence and an inactive. You may put them in different languages other than English. So the problem that we faced was that we gave you all these ways to categorize identities into lifecycle states that make sense to you. But we didn't give ourselves here at SailPoint a way to be able to tell what each one of your lifecycle states means. And it would be a pretty big reach for us to go on and try to determine that on our own. Of course, some of these states are quite obvious, like active. That probably includes active identities. But we still didn't want to make that reach. So the solution that we're going after is to let you decorate each one of your lifecycle states on each one of your identity profiles with something to tell us how you regard the identities in that lifecycle state. There are really just three options for each lifecycle state. There is going to be active. So these are identities who are joining or just frankly active and working at your business. Then there's inactive for the short term. So these are identities that are leaving or have a restricted relationship with your organization. What does that mean? That means that they could be, between 0 and 90 days having departed your organization. Some of our customers, they have specific rules for that because that identity might be coming back. So for instance, someone has an end date, and it could be as simple as a manager forgot to go into Workday and extend that employee. So you put them in a short term where you're going to disable your accounts, but not to start deleting accounts or really removing anything, because that person may actually be intended to continue at the business. Maybe you're renegotiating and you need to bring them back. There are a variety of reasons why you might want to put someone in inactive short term. So go ahead and do that. Now, I think another really important thing to note is that not everybody will have inactive short term. So there are a lot of you out there who are just going to have active and inactive lifecycle states, which would mean, where do I put this third option? You don't have a reason to have inactive short term, so don't use it. But you should always have at least one lifecycle state that has actives and at least one lifecycle state that has inactives for the long term. So leading me to the third state, inactive long term. That just means that they're gone and won't be receiving any additional services from Identity Security Cloud. So now that we have talked about how you're going to code your lifecycle states, let's think about the impact. Specifically, we have gone through and picked out the parts of the system that you cared about the most to give special treatment to inactive identities. The first one, the big one, identity pick lists in the request center. Admins have been very clear to us in the ideas portal that you do not want inactives showing up in the request center. So this is a two-parter. When you do a request on the behalf of and you search for somebody by name, you will only see names belonging to active identities. The other part is when the manager is going to put in a request for their team. In the past, when they picked for my team, it would give them all their team members, including ones who had departed. Now, it will include just the actives. Second, my team UI for managers. This is a big one because managers are a lot of the folks who are in the system as end users. Managers were saying, hey, why is this person who left recently still showing up on my list? I just want to see my active employees, not to think too much about the ones that have worked here before. We saw folks doing workarounds for that, like detaching inactive identities from managers so managers didn't see them. No longer do you have to do that. You can leave inactive identities attached to managers, and when managers go to the team view, they won't see them. Scheduled processing. So this is the job that happens at 8 a.m. in the morning and 8 p.m. in the evening based on your tenant's local time. The reason why we run scheduled processing primarily is for joiner, mover, leaver. So looking at someone's start date or end date and asking basic questions like, is their end date after today or is it before today? And if it's before today, then they may be moving into a terminated state. You define the lifecycle state logic, of course, but we're running these jobs each day, twice a day, so that we can move people between the lifecycle states naturally and keep your business running. So for that reason, actives, of course, are going to be included in scheduled processing, and so are inactives for the short term. The reason why we do the inactives for the short term is because, like I had kind of mentioned on the previous slide, when you're on the 0 to 90 day mark from having departed the business, so you left yesterday, and maybe the business is going to wait 89 days before they go ahead and delete your accounts. But in the meantime, they've gone ahead and disabled your accounts. So you can't get in, but if you did come back, then we could re-enable your accounts. After 90 days, we're going to delete them, and that's going to become a bit more permanent. That's why you see that the inactive short terms are included in scheduled processing so that we can bring them back if we need to do that. And it also serves a couple other various nuances for offboarding as well, particularly getting those identities a processing or refresh every day. Up next, apply changes on the roles, access profiles, and apps UIs. So those are the buttons that you're pressing primarily when you're changing your roles. So for instance, if you add a new role and you expect it to get members, or if you update the membership on a role, those are reasons why you would click the Apply Changes button in the UI. And you're doing that so that we go through all of your identities one by one and run a process called role correlation. So we figure out if we should add that identity to certain roles or remove that identity from certain roles based on the role changes that you've recently made. So we really only care about giving roles to active identities. And for that reason, we are going to run that process on active and inactive for the short-term identities. Once you've moved into for the long-term, we won't run that kind of processing anymore. So while you're waiting for the Apply Changes button to do its thing, it's going to do it quite a bit faster because we're going to filter out the inactives. Apply changes on the Identity Profiles UI. Why is this one different? This Apply Changes button is for a process we call attribute promotion, which is if you've updated an identity attribute, including changing a transform or something along those lines, then we want to go ahead and push that change to all the identities on that identity profile. The reason why we do this for actives, inactives for the short term and for the long term, is because you may be using that button after having changed either the Cloud Lifecycle State attribute or the identity state attribute, which gets you these actives and inactives. So to make sure that all identities get processed in that area, that's why the Apply Changes button runs across all these states. Processing for select identities. You may find some cases where you need to process an individual identity or up to 250 identities on an as-needed basis. And on the documentation for that endpoint, we tell you all the reasons why you might want to use that. If you're asking for it specifically, we're going to do it for any identity, active or inactive. Lastly, identity attribute promotion after aggregations. So this is a really important one to call out, particularly for the bring somebody back from inactive use case. So let's say somebody's left the business and you've moved them to inactive for the long term. So the typical question that we're getting is, what if that person gets rehired? How do we ensure they come back from inactive for the long term? And the way we do that is that after we aggregate an account, if we detect changes, we go ahead and look at the identity to which that account is correlated, and then we process that identity. At that point, we would expect that the lifecycle state logic will be rerun, and then that identity could be moved back into an active lifecycle state. So for instance, if they were inactive for the long term, but then you went into Workday and updated their start date and end date information, and then the day comes where their start date is, that's going to cause them to be brought back. So here's a quick guide on how you might actually map your lifecycle states. There is the very simple use case that I've talked about already. That's kind of represented here, but I'll call it out. If you just went with the defaults, the out-of-the-box setting for Identity Security Cloud, then you'll have two lifecycle states, active and inactive. That's a very easy decision for you to make if that's you. You map active to active, you map inactive to inactive for the long term. Maybe you did something a bit more, you configured a bit more. Here's how we would recommend these kind of common configurations, if you will. So pre-hires, they should always be active. Active, of course, or any flavor of active should always be active. If you're on leave of absence, this is something for you to decide, and it's going to depend just kind of on a number of factors, including the region where your business is. Some businesses will consider folks who are on leave of absence to be inactive. Others will consider them to be active. That choice is up to you. And then lastly, inactive. If you just have one termination state, so like a single inactive, you would do inactive for the long term. If you have a terminated state, where that's somebody who's left the business between 0 and 90 days or 0 and 30 days. You may call them inactive for the short term, so they continue to be processed. And then eventually, you might have another state that says deleted, like this is the state where we delete their accounts. That would probably be mapped to inactive to the long term for you. That's how we would recommend doing that. So the next part is, how do I get into the system and do this, right? You go to an identity profile. You go to the lifecycle states for that identity profile. And then one by one, through your lifecycle states, you're going to go ahead and make this decision. Is it active? Is it inactive for the short term? Is it inactive for the long term? Of course, really big call out here. You're going to be doing this in Sandbox. Don't do this for the first time in production. Do it for the first time in Sandbox. Save your mappings. Make sure you get them all. This is, of course, going to be not filled in when you get to this UI. And until you fill this in, I think this is another really big call out, is all of the identities in your tenant are going to be considered active. We do this because you need to be active to show up in the request center and other places. So we wouldn't want to wait until you make these decisions in order to make somebody active. Otherwise, you wouldn't have identities showing up where you want. We start you off with everybody being active. So think of this as being on autopilot, the active autopilot. We set you up that way. And then when you're ready to take over, you make your classifications on each one of these lifecycle states. And then what do you do next? You press the Apply Changes button. You let it run. Give it a little while. And then you can start to do some validation. So I started this presentation off with the donut, right? I said, typically, customers have 1 in 5 of their identities are inactive. Of course, yours may vary. So let's make sure that yours comes up in a state that feels realistic to you. You know about how many inactives you have. And you can use search to determine that. So you should go to search after Apply Changes has finished running. Of course, you can watch Apply Changes in the monitor menu. Once that's wrapped up, you go to search and you put an attributes.identityState:active. Search for that, get your count, write it down. Then do the same thing for inactive short term and inactive long term. Get your counts, write that down, make your donut. Does it look approximately like the donut that I've got up on the screen? You should have, about 80% active, maybe something like 20% inactive, and just a handful in inactive for the short term if you have any at all. So a really key point to make here is that you definitely should not have more inactive for the short term than inactive for the long term. Inactive for the short term is really meant to be a transient state. Again, the people who are on leaves or have recently left the company, it's not meant to be a permanent holding ground for any identities. So you should see the number in there be quite small. And so far, that's what we've seen play out as customers implement this feature in Sandbox and now in production. So make sure your donut looks realistic, and as long as it does, then great, move on to the next step, which is do a little bit of acceptance testing. So, of course, we tested this feature very thoroughly, but we want you to understand personally how it works. So we want you to hit the big spots of the system that you care about. If you wanted to see inactives out of the request center, go ahead and find an inactive identity, go to the request center, plug in their name, and see if they show up. They shouldn't. If they don't, great, it's working as expected. So now you go back to that impact chart that I had showed you earlier. So you look at the request center, then you look at the manager my team view, then you can look at the apply changes button. Just go ahead and try each one of those out and ensure that you're seeing just the actives the way you want them to. You're not trying to do any big involved testing here. We just want you to give it a whirl through so that you understand how it works and that you feel like it's working right. Of course, you're still doing all these things in Sandbox, right? Once you're certain that it's working the way you want it to, now's where the part where you train your team. So there may not be many people on your team. Maybe you're the only one. Great, then you've trained yourself, right? But go to the other 2 or 3 people that you work with, explain to them how this works, what you did. If there's anybody who has to answer questions like your IT help desk, your support team, something along those lines, explain to them where to find out if an identity is active or inactive. Spoiler, right up on the identity management UI, we'll tell you if an identity is active, inactive for the short term, inactive for the long term. There is a bunch of help guides out in the developer community. Have them read through it, have them internalize what these mean. This will be helpful. If someone calls in and says, all my accounts are, disabled, go ahead and look and see if they're inactive for the long term. That might tell you something. By the way, shout out to the identity management UI. This one also is deployed almost all the way through our production environments and is a critical component to this because it's your window into actually seeing this information and how it is applying to your identities. This is a separate release coming from the same team and relatively new. Hope you like it. Okay, so you've done all the things. You've tested it in Sandbox. You've trained your team. Now's the big time, right? You're going to promote it to production. Promote it to production, following the same steps that you did. It's pretty easy to just click around. That was kind of the whole point of making this feature, is we wanted something that you could implement without having to code. So it should be pretty easy to click around, save, apply. Of course, you could just copy these changes over using our endpoints, potentially using Config Hub. That's why we have all these tools. But go ahead, promote it to production, and then sit back, let it run. And this is the time where you can reach out to your executive team, to the management team. I know some of you have been receiving questions like, why was I able to put in an access request for this person who left? Now you can say, hey, I've solved that problem for you, team. This is not an issue anymore. That's what we want for you. So really hope that you get to this as soon as you can. You go ahead and promote it to production. We're going to be watching adoption here, answering questions you have, building on this in a variety of ways. For example, we haven't implemented this yet for attribute sync, but we've got a pretty good idea of how we're going to do that. Certifications will be another target. There are more places in the system where inactive identities are still, unfortunately, available, but we're going to get them all over time. But today, we're feeling pretty good that we've got all the places that our administrators care about most. So I really hope that you love the feature. And this is the part where you get to be an influencer. Everybody wants to do this, right? I know I've got like 10 followers on Instagram. I feel pretty good about that. We have the developer community here where you can influence us. So we got an announcement out there. It's called Management of Inactive Identities in the product news section. This is where we tell you the nitty-gritty on how all this feature works and how to implement it. Of course, you could watch this recording as well. If you have any questions, any comments, anything that you'd like to see us do next, go ahead and comment right on that product news article. I try to get back to those within 24 hours. I think that's the best way to get out the word. Second, ideas portal. This is a big idea, right? So I put down on this slide that there are 337 people at 260 organizations that voted on this idea. This is why we took it up. In the time since I submitted this slide to Jordan, we're up to 350 voters. So just a sincere thank you for supporting this idea. You rose it to the top. You told us it was a big problem, and we went ahead and solved it. We've got a ton of people adopting it already. It was 22 when I saved this slide. Now it's over 100. I hope that this continues to drive those numbers up. And ideas, get there. This one's shipped. We're going to wait for the next big one to bubble up. So continue using that, continue voting, and that'll help us select what we're going to do next for you. Lastly, product research. I need everybody I can get whenever I put up an in-discovery page with the next thing that we're going to work on to hop on a line, talk to me, let me ask you questions, give me feedback, let me walk you through mocks. We've got a whole team that, this is our specialty, talking to customers, figuring out the problem, building the solutions. Really kind of excited for some of the items that I'll be putting in the product research section next. And hope you jump in there and see you on a call soon. So with that, again, thank you for your time. I hope you enjoy the feature, and write us in the developer community, and we'll get back to you. And hope Hope to see you again next year. Thank you.